Amazing God. May the thoughts that you put on my heart be the right words for these, your people. In 2004, Sharon and I moved from our home in Stanton, Virginia, to our new home, new us home anyway, here in Marietta, New York. Now that wasn't our first interstate move. 6 years earlier, we moved from Skaneateles to Stanton. That was the first time we had to pack up everything, put it in a truck, and move it. Actually, we put it in 2 trucks, and it was 2 moves because I went in January and Sharon followed in May. So when you're making a long-distance move, you need a lot of time to think through what you're doing, what you're going to take to the new location, what you're going to leave behind, and what things are you just plain going to get rid of. Each time we moved, it seemed like the take with us load would get larger. And the leave behind load and the get rid of loads would each get smaller. And at the end of each move, I always wished for some of the things that I'd left behind so I could have them in the new home. In the Exodus story this morning, the Israelites are on the move, running from the Egyptians, wandering in the wilderness, conquering the promised land, and eventually settling there. Their moves would take about 40 years and a generation change of leaders to complete. We can only surmise, after reading the story of the institution of the Passover in Exodus chapter 12, that the people did not have a lot of time to plan the move, load their belongings, or consider the supplies they might need for the journey. Poor planning and a lack of preparation always seem to lead to complaints as the journey gets underway and they discover the lack of necessities they had left behind. So our story this morning is one of complaining. Now, complaints might be expected under these circumstances. In their situation, it's not difficult to understand the panic of these former slaves. They were about 6 weeks into their wandering. Now, 6 weeks doesn't seem very long, given that they still had almost 40 years to go. It is long enough to run out of things you managed to carry with you when you fled Egypt, and then to realize that the idea of living off the land was better when we thought of it than it was in reality. Of course they're hungry, and they're afraid, and they're pretty sure they made a big mistake launching off into this wilderness journey with Moses and Aaron. Granted, their complaint, at least the complaint that we read about, is a bit over the top. If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, in verse 3. We all know how it is when things are bad. We look back, and what was bad before doesn't seem as bad in the moment. The Israelites were conveniently forgetting that they were slaves back there in Egypt. And here's an interesting idea. They sat by the flesh pots, which the scholars tell us were big pots of simmering meat. But they ate their fill of bread. So they had meat in Egypt, but they just didn't get any of it. And yet that memory is better than their current reality. Or so they thought, anyway. Okay, God said, I'll take care of it. I'll rain down bread from heaven. Well, bread from heaven is kind of unusual, don't you think? Maybe it was Cheerios or Honey Nut Cheerios. There have been various attempts to describe the phenomenon from a scientific point of view. There might be a rational explanation, but that's not the point here. We don't need to explain this miracle, only accept it as a sign of God's providing for those he has called. Even those being fed didn't really understand. The rained down bread doesn't get named in our text until a few verses later, when it's called manna. Manna translates in Hebrew to a question. What is it? That was the question they asked when they first saw that stuff in the ground after complaining that they were hungry. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. That means that the Exodus people are now sustained and nourished by a question. What is it? It seems only part of the question they should have been considering. They should have wondered, what is God doing? Maybe by paying attention to what is happening around them on a regular basis, they might have seen God at work in the times when things were going bad, or especially in times when life was difficult. And surely life was difficult for these folks as they wandered through the desert. In our gospel reading this morning, the complaining in Jesus' parable could lead to the same implied question. What is God doing? The economic policy and workers' compensation Jesus speaks about in this parable certainly was unusual in his day and continues to be unusual in ours. We may be quick to translate this parable out of the economic world in which it is set and make it a spiritual change that is somehow more palatable for us. Maybe the parable should be about accepting new people, realizing that when anyone joins the fellowship of believers, they become inheritors of the whole promise of God. Even though there are those of us who've labored long and hard for some reward, these new folks get the entire blessing, even though they haven't put in the same amount of pew time or church service time as those of us who've been here for a long time. And like the all-day workers in the story, we might resent the generosity of our Master. We've borne the burden of the day. We've worked in the hot sun. You have endured long sermons and tedious lessons and have labored hard to walk that straight and narrow path. Shouldn't we get a bigger reward? Well, that's only one interpretation, to be sure. And there's plenty of work for the church if we go there. But let's not assume that Jesus wasn't trying to change our whole value system at this moment. Maybe he was asking us to consider what our economics are based upon how we go about determining the worth of all things, not just employees or managers, but of all people. Maybe Jesus is trying to change our assumptions about the good life, or how the world ought to work. Jesus was turning things upside down. That's risky, to be sure. And in truth, we don't like change. We'd rather adjust to the way things are and continue with our complaining. We'd rather do that than work towards a change that might make things better for everyone, including ourselves. So what would the world look like if we shaped it and lived life in accordance to the unlimited grace and generosity God offers everyone? How might that change what we do, or how we do it? What might that look like? Is it even possible? Such a change requires a different way of measuring value, of not comparing, but by setting aside complaints, jealousy, and envy when we consider others. What are the burdens of the day? Who might we be shutting out? How do we labor in the Lord's vineyard without feeling like we're owed something, but simply enjoying the opportunity for service and connection that God brings us? Settling in for the long haul in our faith journey is to acknowledge that our cup overflows when we consider what God has done for us and the world. Much of what we think about when we consider how the world works doesn't fit this model. But then we have to remember the abundance of grace and love that God has to offer. More than enough for all of us. Jesus, with his life, death, and resurrection, has turned everything upside down. He lived as if there was more than enough of God for all the people in his time and ours. And wouldn't it be glorious if we could live for today as Jesus did and continue living that way in the long term? All things are possible. God has given us enough. It's our job to share that grace and love with everyone we meet.